In today's video, I have a really interesting topic. It relates to evolution, but in particular, what we're going to talk about is how evolution is being taught at BYU and how it's being taught in a way using intelligent design concepts to increase the acceptability and palatability of the theory of evolution to religious students. And we'll talk about some of the consequences of that and how it ends up being an impediment for BYU students and members of the church overall in understanding what they really believe. In particular, what we'll find out is that there is a large number of members of the church who say that they believe in the theory of evolution, and what we'll find out is that most of the membership of the church, it turns out, in studies and surveys, what they end up believing is a form of intelligent design, but think that it's the theory of evolution. It's an interesting dynamic. Let me share this with you. Before I share the information about evolution that I wanted to share today, let me just mention that I will be at the Firm Foundations conference, which is upcoming, and I'll be speaking there. Those are the times I'll be speaking on Thursday, September 4th from 10:15 to 11:05 a.m. And I'm going to be presenting evidence for the shroud of Turin. I've done some videos on that in the past. There's also some updated, more recent evidence that I'll address, and I think that you'll enjoy that. And then on Saturday, which would be September 6th, from 7:15 to 8:05 p.m., I'm going to do one related to fortifications that appear to be Moronized fortifications and are consistent with Moronized fortifications occurring in the eastern United States. You can get the tickets at the Book of Mormon Evidence.org website. It's going to be at the Davis Conference Center in Layton, Utah, September 4th to 6th, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. If you do show up there and you know who I am, I would encourage you to introduce yourself. I very much enjoy meeting the individuals that I don't get to meet on the other end of these podcasts. Okay, so let's first get to the information that I wanted to share with you related to evolution. Now, the theory of evolution, most of you understand the basics of it quite well, relates to the theory for how we get all of the plants and animals and people. Now, but a key aspect of this is that for the theory of evolution, a key assumption is that mutations are random and are not directed toward beneficial results. Or in other words, there is no creator that is guiding the evolution or directing it towards a particular desired result. All right. That is a key necessary assumption for the theory of evolution. It is the basis on which all of the theories related to the DNA dating and so forth are involved. So just asking Grok this, and he says, yes, standard evolutionary theory assumes that mutations are random with respect to their effects on an organism's fitness. This means mutations occur without any foresight or direction. So a key part of the theory of evolution is that the mutations occur without any foresight or direction from a creator towards producing a particular outcome or type of species or anything like that. And instead, it comes through errors and is determined by natural selection and so forth. So when you look at this aspect or this particular component of the theory of evolution, this is clearly in contravention. It's clearly contrary to church doctrine as we know it, because with God as the creator, even if you go with whether you go with an intelligent design theory or another aspect, it's clear from the scriptures that even if God used evolutionary processes in the creation, he did it with foresight or direction and guidance on how things would occur. If that's the case, and it is, then the result of that is that all of the outgrowths from the theory of evolution based on dating and randomness are all inapposite. They all don't work because they're based on an assumption that we know to be untrue as faithful members of the church. Now, as many of you know, the church has an official neutral position on the doctrine of evolution. Now, it should be emphasized and understood that the church is stating that it's neutral does not mean that it's stating that there is no conflict between the theory of evolution and traditional scriptural understanding. They're not saying that there's no conflict. They're just saying that it's an officially neutral position. There have been a number of church members in the past who have been quite vehement about the conflicts that occur, and I'm just going to show you a couple of these uh, that that pop up. Okay, so many will know President Joseph Fielding Smith. He wrote a book, Man, His Origin and His Destiny. In it, he wrote, among other things, he called the theory of evolution the theory that man evolved, particularly the aspect of the evolution of man, that man evolved from lower forms of life. He called it the most pernicious doctrine ever entering the mind of man. In other forms, he called it the Satan's key weapon in down here it says organic evolution. That theory is Satan's chief weapon in this dispensation in his attempt to destroy the divine mission of Jesus Christ. So very, very hot words, right? And he said, another one of his quotes, most emphatically, you cannot believe in this theory of evolution of the origin of man and at the same time accept the plan of salvation as set forth by God. You choose the one or the other because they are in direct conflict. There's a gulf separating them, which is so great that it cannot be bridged. Okay, so clearly his understanding was that the conflicts between the theory of evolution as the origin of man, not again, we're not talking about whether there have been evolutionary processes or God use of natural selection or God using evolutionary processes for the creation. He is correctly stating the theory of evolution, which includes the origin of man as being from random mutations without any foresight or direction or guidance from God, and no Adam and Eve. It's instead evolving from most recent common ancestors with chimpanzees, so forth. He says that aspect it's not reconcilable with church doctrine. Now, as you know, the church has since taken an officially neutral position. I'll just note Mormon doctrine was another one where it talked about violent conflict in terms of revealed religion and the theory of evolution. Okay, but since then, if you look at Mormon views on evolution, they haven't evolved in a sense, right? There have been while the majority of members of the church traditionally have taken a view that the theory of evolution is incorrect, that God created man in his own image and so forth. There was an Adam and Eve, a Garden of Eden. Adam was the first man. His fall is what necessitated the plan of salvation. All of these have been sort of key doctrinal aspects throughout the scriptures. And so that's been the traditional view over the years. But despite that, there's also been a number of LDS scientists who've sort of taken a position supporting evolutionary aspects, looking at the data, evolution of some species. And in the end, the church ended up taking no official position on whether or not evolution has occurred, nor on the validity of evolutionary synthesis as a scientific theory. Now, there's a church site, if you go and you look at what it says about evolution, and this is a publication by the church, and it talks about how, the church handled the science related to evolution when it came out. It talks about how there are these statements against it, but then there are also members, including apostles who are scientists, who ended up agreeing with much of what was coming out with evolutionary studies. And it talks about how this kind of came to a head where it says Latter-day Saints and their leaders found themselves on both sides of this issue. James E. Talmage and John A. Widsoe, who were two professional scientists who were also apostles, they regarded scientific discovery of truth as evidence of God's use of natural laws to govern the universe. And so they wanted to accept the theory of evolution. But notice something important here. Notice that their logic for accepting the theory of evolution is actually not a full acceptance of the theory of evolution. It's a sort of a misunderstanding or a sort of a cleansing of the most objectionable parts of the theory of evolution, and that is the essential that God has no hand in the evolution. Because what they said is that they think it shows God's use of natural laws. So it shows a God behind it who's actually designed and running it. That's contrary to the theory of evolution as commonly and professionally understood, in which, as we already saw, in which a key assumption is that there is no foresight or direction or guidance on the mutations that occur. So there's no, direction or goal to get to a particular species or to get to man being the way that we came out. You wouldn't have man being created in the image of God, because that implies creation with an intent that the individuals come out to be like God, not a random process. Okay, so this is the kind of one of the early indications of where you get church members who, here Talmage and Widsoe, who are sort of accepting the theory of evolution, but they're accepting a more of an intelligent design version of it, defending evolution, calling themselves an evolutionist, but really their theory is an intelligent design theory. Okay, and then meanwhile, on the other side was Joseph Fielding Smith, who believed the biblical account of the creation, so on. And the way that in 1931, it was sort of put to rest temporarily, there was discussion as to whether the church would come out and make a statement on one side or the other. And it was President Heber J. Grant who essentially said, we're not going to come out one side or the other. We're going to leave it alone. And this is his statement, which you've probably heard before, where Heber J. Grant said, he urged leaders, I'll note that's leaders, not necessarily all members of the church. So I'm not a leader in the church. I'm not obligated to not take sides. But he urged leaders of the church not to take sides on the issue, instead saying to leave geology, biology, archaeology, anthropology, no one of which has to do with the salvation of the souls of mankind, to scientific research while we magnify our calling in the realm of the church. Now, this decision has both good and bad effects. And one of the good effects of it is to sort of put to rest, or at least calm down some of the tempers or flares on the two sides of the issue, to stop the arguing about it. It also allowed members a little bit more, we'll call it, acceptability of pursuing some of the scientific research in these particular areas. But there is a downside of it, because while it's true that geology, biology, archaeology, and anthropology don't have to do with the salvation of the souls of mankind, and they're not directed towards the salvation of the souls of mankind, they nevertheless do affect the salvation of the souls of mankind by either affirming or undermining people's faith in God as a creator. I mean, definitely what you're getting out of the geology, biology, archaeology, and anthropology, some of that research will bring stuff that challenges people's faith. And so it absolutely does have to do with the salvation of the souls of men to one extent, which is whether it affects the faith and beliefs of members of the church. And so to that extent, it may have been a mistake for church members to sort of step back and to not be more involved in this issue, to the extent that church members have stepped back and not continued to flesh out the conflicts between science and religion a little bit more. Instead, what they've done is sort of allowed those conflicts to fester and result in some people leaving, where maybe if it had been sorted out better or some more time had been spent on it, we'd get to a better place on some of these issues and a better understanding on some of these issues. Okay, now let's look specifically at BYU. Now, here I just ask AI, tell me about an article. I knew that there was an article and studies done by BYU professors in particular about their efforts and goal to sort of strategically try to get BYU students, religious students, to better accept, more increasingly accept the theory of evolution. And so I said, tell me about the study that was done about that. And so here's a little bit of the information about it. So there was a key study. It was done over a number of years, but there was a publication on it in 2019. Involves several biology professors at BYU and others from BYU. And it's also from some other religious institutions. They're focusing on how they could better and get religious students to accept the theory of evolution, what they could do to improve acceptance of evolution among religious students. And what they came up with is really involves putting in a little intelligent design type sweeteners in the theory of evolution as taught at these schools. And so the way that the theory of evolution is taught at BYU, and it actually has been for a number of years, is sort of with a sweetener to say that God could be behind evolution, which is contrary to the full theory of evolution. So in some of my videos, I've talked about the full theory of evolution. That assumes random, unguided mutations. It's not a God-designed creation or development. But the version that's being taught at BYU is done in a way to sort of imply or indicate that there's no conflict between God and religion. No conflict between the theory of evolution and religion. That God could be behind the evolution. It could be a process that God is using. That's not the standard theory of evolution. They call it, they use what they call a reconciliation module as a strategic approach to try to get the church member students to lower their barriers and defense mechanisms that would otherwise reject the theory of evolution as being against the religion, to try to get them to sort of accept it as something that's compatible with their beliefs, and then to get them to understand the theory of evolution more. That's the studies that they described, and they have had great success with it. So in the study, it says they found significant increases in evolution acceptance across the BYU students and other students at these other religious institutions using this kind of module, with a 17.5 to over 30% movement towards acceptance of the theory of evolution by using this sort of intelligent design reconciliation type of module to get them to lower their religious belief objections to the theory of evolution. So let's go ahead and look at those studies. So this is a first one. This is, again, published by a number of people. It has several BYU professors among they call it using a reconciliation module leads to large gains in evolution acceptance. And it's talking about the teaching of evolution at colleges, at religious colleges in particular. And what we'll do is I'll scroll through and just talk about a couple of things that show up in this study. Okay, so as it says here, too many students. It's very much an activist approach to getting people to increase the acceptance of evolution. So you'll see that throughout. It's not neutral at all. It's definitely a design to get the students to believe a particular way and to accept their particular theory. It's not just a design to neutrally project information. I don't know how you feel about that. I'm sure they think they're doing the right thing. I mean, in their mind, the theory of evolution is a proven fact, and they're just looking for ways to overcome religious objections to get the students to believe this way. But they've been doing these studies on the BYU students, and they're doing pre-essays and post-essays, and they're looking at what, particular methods and teaching ideas and strategies are used to increase the acceptance to get the more students to say that they accept the theory of evolution. Okay, so again, looking at their study that they've published. So as they say, too many students reject the theory of evolution because they view it as incompatible with their religious belief. And then they talk about how, some say that abandoning religious belief is the only way to help religious individuals accept evolution. And they say they have a different theory, which is, like I said, really uses some intelligent design type components, what they call a reconciliation module instead of the past approaches, which was essentially a more direct approach to tear down religious belief altogether. This approach, as used at BYU and some other religious schools, is not to reject and try to destroy your religious belief altogether, but it instead is trying to get you to say, hey, there's no conflict, you can still believe this, and kind of accept a modified version of the theory of evolution where it's more of a God-guided evolution as opposed to atheistic, no involvement of God, random evolution. Okay, so we'll scroll down there, and there are a couple of key points that I wanted to show you. Again, it talks about perhaps no greater cause of tension between faith and science than the theory of evolution. That is true, which is why Joseph Fielding Smith was one saying it's like, Satan, one of Satan's biggest weapons, right? One of the most pernicious evils, because he saw what it was doing to people's faith in God as the creator. And to the plan of understanding of the plan of salvation with God as our Father, us made in His image, fall of Adam, a need for salvation. All of this stuff kind of hinges on God as a powerful creator, Adam who fell, us having a need for a savior and redemption to be able to be redeemed from the fall. All of that's kind of undermined if you don't believe in God as a creator, or God creating Adam, or if you don't believe in the Adam and Eve, or that Adam fell, and then what's the need of the creator? It causes a lot of problems when people really think it out. But what they'll show in this particular module is by getting people to think that, hey, there is no real conflict. What they found is that, at least in that short term, they got much higher acceptance of the theory of evolution, and also people sort of maintaining their religiosity and beliefs, at least on the short term. Long-term effect is a different issue. Okay, so it talks about how taking the direct approach of just kind of undermining the religion, saying that religion is bogus or garbage, it didn't work. So this talks about how the prior approach, they would call it what they called a deficit model, which was to sort of take the approach saying that, hey, if you don't accept evolutionary theory, it's simply a result of a deficit of understanding or inadequate reasoning ability. In other words, it was if you don't believe the theory of evolution, you're stupid model. And surprisingly, that didn't work for that well. And then there was another one, which was like, well, if you just focus on the facts, and people will, see that the facts are really strong and they'll accept it. And then it's like, that was a little bit more successful. And then they propose a third model, which is what they call, again, this reconciliation model. And they said, there is a problem here, which is that there's a disparity between the religious beliefs of biology educators and those of students. And, they note there's only, like, in terms of the number or percent of evolutionary biologists who are religious versus the American population, it's like 1/8. The evolutionary biologists are not religious. And so there's a disconnect between the educators and their audiences about religious beliefs. And they're saying, hey, you have to understand the religious beliefs if you want to win over the religious people to evolution. The first thing that they do is this, okay, so they ran this through basically first year biology students. They had people do pre-surveys and post-surveys, and again, BYU was one of the focus universities. They're doing pre-surveys and post-surveys to gauge attitudes and understandings about evolution, and then they do their module. And in particular with BYU, they said, key aspects of the model are to emphasize the church's neutrality about the doctrine of evolution, and really in emphasizing the neutrality of the church position about evolution, they're implying that because the church is neutral, it means there is no conflict. That's not what it means. The church's neutral position does not mean that there isn't a conflict. It just means that the church's position has been neutral. But they're using that neutrality to imply that there is no conflict and that there is no harm in accepting, the theory of evolution aspect. And again, this is not just about God's use of evolutionary processes. This is about the theory of evolution altogether. So they say the first is to emphasize that the church is neutral. And again, they say the major focus is to help students understand and become familiar that there's no doctrine against evolution. Okay. And so they do this pre-study and post-study. And after doing the pre-study and the post-study, then they produce the results. And what they'll put in a graph here. So what you'll see is there is a change in the acceptance of evolution. So here they show that after doing this approach of convincing the students, hey, there's no conflict, there's no church position, no official church position, there's no harm. And then another aspect of what they did too here is to try to promote and point out role models of faithful, faithful scientific members of the church as role models for the students to look up to. And sometimes that's the teacher itself or him or herself or others to try to say, hey, these are role models for what you can be too, where you can be smart and believe in evolution but still be faithful. So that positioning of the role model is also an important part of increasing acceptance. And what they found is after the modules that they gave, the blue part was the full acceptance of evolution, orange is limited acceptance, and the others are rejection. So before the module, you had 30-some% is all that had fully accepted evolution. After their module, 70%. So by doing these modules, they say that they were able to push the number of BYU students who had full acceptance of the theory of evolution from 38% all the way up to 70%. Huge gains, and they kind of trumpet these results. Okay. And then they have their conclusion saying, religious students demonstrate gains when offered this kind of reconciliation module. Okay, so then what they've done with that, actually not that one, this one, here's an example of one of the modules that's being used. It's like reconciling evolution and religion. They give this this is an instructor guide, right? This is how you can help the students. And in it they say, okay, here's your cultural barriers, right? Your cultural barriers to be considered. These are your cultural barriers for your students to not accept the material. So many cultural barriers for students who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ stem from how they read Genesis. They might believe in microevolution, but not macroevolution. They might believe that animals evolved, but not humans. They might believe that there was no death before the fall. They might believe that the earth is 6,000 years old. They might believe that the animals on earth today survived Noah's flood. So these are the barriers that they're designed to overcome. Now, what you'd be interested in this is, again, going back to that Heber J. Grant statement. He says, hey, geology, biology, we'll leave it alone. Geology, biology, archaeology, whatever, they're not involved with salvation. But what you see is how it's taught, they are definitely focused on aspects of salvation because they see the barriers these are doctrinal beliefs. These are understandings of the scriptures. They are working on the theology to try to overcome the theological aspects to get the belief up. But anyway, so that's an example of a module. And so then we'll go to this one where they then had a sort of a longitudinal study of attitudes. And this is, they were able to compare not just people within the same term of how many people they were able to convince after the module, but they're also able to pull some results from BYU in the late 80s to early 90s about acceptance of evolution, how they were doing things then, and compare it versus now. And what they saw is a very large shift in the percentage of students who fully accept, say, at least say they fully accept the theory of evolution. Okay. And what they say too is one of the key aspects that they think made a difference for the increased acceptance of the theory of evolution compared to 1980s, 1990s is the essential reduction in the number of church leaders speaking out against evolution. They said they really haven't had that since Packer and before, who had made some comments against evolution, how it wasn't consistent with the gospel. And they're saying that that lack of talking about it then helps with the aspect of pushing the church neutrality on the topic to indicate that it's compatible and it's not a threat to religion. And then with that focus, here as they show, these are percentages. The white box is the 1987 to 1996, and this is the more recent 2014 to 2016. And so the percentage of students who about the theory of evolution indicated that they felt that it conflicted with their religion. That was 27% of students said that they felt that it conflicted with their religion. And there's so some of these should be cumulative. So things that considered the theory of evolution offensive, improbable, flawed, discomfort, all of these would sort of stack on each other. So what you really had was a majority of the students expressing discomfort or rejection in some form, with 27% of the total number saying their main issue is that it's a religious conflict. And how the change with this focus with a module that they've done more recently and the lack of church talking about the opposing evolution, at least more vocally, is that percent has dropped all the way down to about 6%. So only 6%. And the more recent one expressed that they felt that it conflicted with religion. And then on the acceptance side, those who expressed full acceptance back in the 80s to 90s was only 13% approximately, where now that's up between 35 to 40% expressing full acceptance. Now, what's interesting though is that even though these people say, BYU students say, and the members say that it's full acceptance, when they ask them uh, to when they ask them to describe the acceptance, sometimes what you see is it's really an intelligent design type basis. So here's an example. This was one student's response. To me, the concept of evolution makes sense. There's ample evidence for it. Evidence means truth, God's truth. Just because science has proven that evolution happens, why should that mean that God was not involved in that process? The theory of evolution is correct. God is behind it. And this is very common. So the individuals that say, hey, I'm an evolutionist, I accept the theory of evolution, the ones that they got to say that they accept the theory of evolution, a lot of them, it's really a form of believing that it's God directing. God's involved in the process, God's behind it, God's directing it, which is contrary to the key assumption of the standard theory of evolution. And so here was a more recent study. This was in 2017, and this, not to BYU students, was out to members of the church. When it asked them, this was the Next Mormon study, Benjamin Knoll, detailed look at Mormon beliefs on evolution and human origins. So it's a survey. So in the survey, when it depends. What they found is that it depends on how they asked the students. I mean, it depends on how they asked the people. If you don't say it's about the theory of evolution specifically, but if you say, hey, God created Adam and Eve sometime in the last 10,000 years, and humans did not evolve from other life forms. Do you believe that, or do you not believe that? And what you find is that 53% plus 21% all believe that. 53%, the majority, saying they believe that God created Adam and Eve sometime in the last 10,000 years. Humans did not evolve from other life forms. That is totally contrary to the theory of evolution, right? 53% are confident and say they know that that's true. That majority of the members of the church that they asked, and what they found was that those that said they were active was even higher. And then an additional 21% that believe and have faith that is probably true. So it's over 70% saying that they believed it. And of the active Mormons, I think you added up and it got over 80%. But then when you ask in a different way, just about evolution, you say evolution. Evolution is the best explanation for how God brought about the emergence and development of life on Earth. You had 24% plus 25% thinking, yeah, that's probably true, plus an additional 17% say might be true, but have doubts. And so it's a very significant. This one was more about half and half on that way. So it depends on how you ask the question. And again, this gets to a little bit of, do members of the church really understand what they believe? Do they understand what they believe? And I think that what you actually have is many members of the church who say they believe the theory of evolution or accept the theory of evolution, consider themselves as accepting the theory of evolution. They believe that God was behind it and directing it. That's contrary to standard evolutionary theory. It's a key assumption of evolutionary theory that the mutations occur without any foresight or direction. Now, in the BYU modules, what they'll do is they'll call it a theistic evolution as opposed to atheistic evolution. And they say in this theistic evolution, God's not necessary for the process, but he could be behind it. But it's really only if it's a God that's exercising no hand in anything, not changing anything, not guiding anything, not directing anything, because it's functionally equivalent. It's all based on it still being random and unguided. And the idea that it's random and unguided is just frankly contrary to the scriptures. So I think that faithful members of the church really, if they fully assessed, their beliefs, even if they say, hey, I'm an evolutionist, I believe in the theory of evolution, when you really boiled it down, they believe in a form of intelligent design with God guiding and directing it and not random. It might say, well, what difference does that make then? Well, in particular for my issue with dating and DNA, all of that is based on the assumption of randomness. Because what happens is, you can look at mutations, and I would agree that mutations are random. At least the ones that we see out, mutations are random. We're not talking about the creation, we're just talking about now. And with mutations for all different species, you can see there's a certain small percent that are beneficial. There's the majority, most of them have no effect. And then there's a percent that have a negative effect. And it's actually, most have no effect, most mutations have no effect. There's a higher percentage of those that have negative effect versus those that have positive effect. And so realistically, over time, things devolve. You have a genetic entropy rather than improvement. The theory of evolution has not shown improvements in species that become more complex. You might have elimination of a feature that's not needed. You might have some minor changes, but not significant improvements in development of new, more complex, better life forms. It's just not really shown. But the theory is that, hey, with evolution, if you have enough time, even though not very many mutations are beneficial on a random basis, but if you had enough time, if you make it millions of years, then maybe it could work. If you had, on the other hand, a system that wasn't random, that's intended and designed with foresight, like we would believe about the creation, then there's no need for those long time frames. I'm not saying it has to be 6,000 years or anything like that, but you don't need millions of years. You don't need millions of years to get the creation of the species if you have a God behind it with a plan and design. And let me just show a few scriptures which are very clear of God's plan and design about this. So, for example, Genesis 1, God said, "Let us make man in our own image. In our image, after our likeness." God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him, male and female created he them. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. It should be quite obvious that this is completely contrary to the idea of theistic evolution, of the idea of, well, maybe there's God behind it, but he has no hand in anything. He's not involved in anything. It's all random. You make this, at the very least, even though it doesn't show the details of how it was done, it at the very least shows it was done with an intent and a design for mankind to be in a particular image or likeness. You don't get that from random. You only get that if there's an intent or design for the final product of how you get there. And then also in the idea that God just lets, hey, set up a program, it all runs itself on random. This shows that it's a work which is done. It's a work which he had made. He rested from his work. It's an involvement in an act of God, not a passive watchmaker. Moses 3:4-5 is another example of this. As it says here, this is the Lord talking. "Now behold, I say unto you, that these are the generations of the heaven and of the earth when they were created, in the day that I, the Lord God, made the heaven and the earth, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth. For I, the Lord God, created all things of which I have spoken spiritually, before they were naturally upon the face of the earth." In other words, he's saying, I, the Lord God, made the heaven and the earth and everything on it, all the plants, everything. It was even created all spiritually before created naturally. It's all, in other words, all done with an immense design for the final product of how you get there. We don't necessarily have the details of it, how it was all eventually implemented, but we're told that it is all a grand design. So it's all made spiritually before naturally upon the earth. It had not even caused rain upon the face of the earth yet. He also created all the children of men, not yet a man to till the ground. In other words, all of the people were spiritually created ahead of time before they were yet put on the earth. So it's all a matter of design, not just a natural random processes. In heaven I created I them, and there was not yet flesh upon the earth, neither in the water, neither in the air. It was all planned ahead of time, all of the people, all of the creations. Okay, another example, Mosiah 4:9, believe in God, believe that he is, and that he created all things. Throughout the scriptures, the prophets use the creation as the key example of God's power and of his existence, the evidence of his existence. For example, when Alma talks with Korihor denies the existence of God. Alma challenges him, what evidence have ye that there is no God? You have none. But on the other hand, he says, all things denote there is a God. So all things witness or testify there has to be a God to have made these clearly designed things, these beautiful, complex, wonderful, clearly designed. The evidence that there's a creator, you couldn't have something so amazing and complex out of randomness. It denotes or proves that there is a God, even the earth and all things that are upon the face of it, all the planets which move in the regular form, they witness that there is a supreme creator. And then another couple that I added, finally, just D&C 59:21, it talks about how we offend God when we confess not his hand in all things. When we take a view that he was not involved in creation, that everything was random, it offends him. And then finally, in Joseph Smith history, when in the first vision, when he asks about the churches, what church is true, and the Lord makes a condemning statement about the churches that were in existence at the time, one of the condemning things he said is that they teach for doctrine the commandments of men, having a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. And what he's really saying is deny the power of God, right? So they teach about God, but they deny the power thereof. And again, the greatest example or evidence we have of of God's power is the creation. That's always what the prophets have turned to as the evidence of the power of God. And so it's important that when we talk about, I don't know the details of everything, how the earth was created and how we were created, but I know that it's important to not deny the power of God and that we need to acknowledge that He is the creator and He is behind it. All right, thanks. Let me know if you have any thoughts or comments.